Elias Kane hadn't spoken to another human being in 4 years. Not because he couldn't, not because he'd forgotten how, but because every person he'd ever trusted had either died or walked away, and after a while a man stops opening the door. His cabin sat high in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains of northern New Mexico, tucked into a shelf of granite and pine where the wind never fully stopped and the snow came early and stayed late. He'd built it himself 30 winters ago, when he was 22 and full of the kind of anger that young men mistake for strength. He'd come up the mountain to escape a life that had beaten him raw, a father who drank, a mother who vanished, a brother who bled out in a barroom fight over $6. Elias had buried what was left of his family in a single year, and when the last shovel of dirt hit the last grave, he turned his back on the world below and never looked down again. 30 winters, he kept a small herd of goats for milk and cheese, grew potatoes and turnips in a garden carved out of rocky soil, and had a mule named Salt and a dog named Clove who'd shown up one autumn half-starved and never left. That was his world. He was 52 now and looked older. His beard had gone from black to iron grey. His hands were scarred from decades of rope and blade and frost, but he was still strong, still alive, which was more than most men who lived the way he did could say. It was the first week of November when the women came. The sky had been heavy all morning, the kind of grey that presses down on you like a hand, and Elias had spent the day stacking firewood against the south wall of the cabin in preparation for what he knew would be a hard winter. The aspens had turned gold 2 weeks earlier than usual, and the elk had moved down into the valleys already, both signs that the cold would come fast and mean. He was driving the last wedge into a stubborn log when Clove lifted his head, ears forward, a low growl building in his throat. Elias straightened up and listened, wind through the pines, the creak of branches, and then underneath it something else, the sound of hooves on loose stone, faint but steady, coming up the eastern trail. Nobody came up the eastern trail, not anymore. The trappers had stopped using it years ago when the beaver dried up, and the Ute and Apache both avoided this stretch of mountain during the cold months. Whoever was coming was either lost or desperate, and in these mountains both things could kill you. Elias picked up his rifle and walked to the edge of the clearing where the trail broke through the tree line. Clove followed, still growling. Salt, the mule, watched from behind the fence with the blank expression of an animal who had seen everything and feared nothing. They appeared one at a time through the trees, like ghosts assembling from the fog. Women, all of them. The first was tall and broad-shouldered, maybe 40, riding a paint horse that looked as tired as she did. Behind her came 2 younger women on foot, one carrying a bundle wrapped in blankets, the other leading a limping mare by a frayed rope. Then more, a woman with grey streaks in her hair and a face carved from stone. Twin girls no older than 15. An elderly woman hunched forward on a mule, her eyes closed, her lips moving in what might have been prayer. A young mother with a baby strapped to her chest and a toddler clinging to her skirt. And at the very back, walking alone, a woman who moved with the quiet authority of someone who had once led others and was now leading them again through the worst chapter of their lives. 10 women, 3 children, 4 horses, 2 mules, and nothing else except the clothes on their backs and whatever was in the bundles they carried. Elias didn't lower his rifle. "That's far enough," he said. His voice came out rough, rusty from years of disuse. The tall woman at the front reined in her horse. She studied him with dark, steady eyes that didn't flinch at the rifle or the dog or the tone. "We need shelter," she said in English, clear but accented. "One night, maybe 2, then we move on. There's a trading post 40 miles south," Elias said. "You passed it." "We were turned away." "Why?" She didn't answer immediately. The woman at the back of the group, the one who walked alone, stepped forward. She was perhaps 50, with high cheekbones and deep-set eyes that held the kind of calm that only comes after everything worth fearing has already happened. "Because we are Apache," she said, "and because we are women without men. The trading post does not help people like us." Elias looked at the group again. Exhausted horses, thin faces. The toddler, clinging to its mother's leg, was shivering. The elderly woman on the mule hadn't opened her eyes. "Where are your men?" he asked. The older woman's jaw tightened. "Dead, taken, scattered. We were part of a band near the Mescalero agency. Soldiers came in the spring. They said we had to move to a new reservation further south, dry land with no game and no water. Our men resisted. Some were killed. Others were put in chains and marched away. The women and children were told to follow or be left behind. We followed for 3 weeks. Then we stopped following. You ran." "We survived," she corrected him. "We have been moving since the summer, trying to find a place where we can rest through the winter. Every town, every post, every ranch has turned us away. You are the last door we can knock on before the snow closes the mountain." Elias felt something shift in his chest, something he hadn't felt in years, an uncomfortable pull, like a muscle that had gone stiff from disuse and was being asked to stretch. He looked at the baby strapped to the young mother's chest. It was asleep, its tiny face pressed against her collarbone. He looked at the twin girls, standing close together, their breath visible in the cold air. He looked at the elderly woman on the mule, and he thought about his own mother, who had vanished one winter morning and never come back, and how he'd spent 30 years on this mountain, trying not to think about what might have happened to her if she'd had nowhere to go. "One night," he said, lowering the rifle. "The barn. There's hay for the horses and room for all of you. I'll bring blankets." The tall woman nodded. "Thank you. Don't thank me yet. One night." He turned and walked back toward the cabin, his heart beating in a way it hadn't in years, and he wasn't sure if it was fear or something else entirely. By the way, if this story is touching your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave us a comment telling us which country you're listening from. We love knowing where our listeners are. Now let's continue. That first night, Elias didn't sleep. He sat in his cabin with the door bolted and the fire burning low, listening to the sounds coming from the barn. Muffled voices, the stamp of horses, the thin wail of the baby that rose and fell like wind through a canyon. Clove lay by the door, nose pointed toward the barn, tail thumping occasionally, as if to say, "They're still there." Elias told himself it was just one night. In the morning they'd leave, and things would go back to the way they were. Quiet, simple, alone. But morning came, and the snow came with it. Not the light dusting he'd expected, but a full blizzard. The kind that erased the world outside the window and turned the air into a wall of white. The temperature dropped so fast that ice formed on the inside of the cabin windows by noon. Nobody was going anywhere. Elias pulled on his coat and fought his way through the wind to the barn. Inside, the women had organized themselves with a precision that surprised him. The horses were fed and brushed. The hay had been arranged into sleeping areas, each one neat and efficient. The elderly woman, whose name he would learn was Hosea, sat propped against a saddle with 2 blankets around her and a cup of something warm in her hands. The twins were braiding each other's hair. The young mother nursed her baby in a corner, the toddler asleep beside her. And in the center of the barn, the older woman, the leader, whose name was Apache, was dividing dried meat into careful portions. "Storm's bad," Elias said from the doorway. "Could last 3 days, maybe more." Apache looked up. "We will stay out of your way. You'll freeze out here in 3 days. We have survived worse." "I'm not doubting that, but the barn's not insulated for a blizzard this size, and that old woman needs to be near a real fire." Apache studied him for a long moment. Then she spoke in Apache to Hosea, who opened her eyes, looked at Elias, and said something back that made several of the women smile. "She says you look like a bear who forgot how to hibernate," Apache translated. Elias almost smiled. "Almost. Bring her inside, and the mother with the children. The rest of you can rotate in groups to warm up." By that evening, saw his cabin, which had held 1 man and 1 dog for 30 years, held 5 women, 2 children, a baby, and a dog who couldn't stop wagging his tail. The fire roared. The women sat along the walls, quiet at first, watching him the way he imagined they'd watched every stranger for months, with the guarded patience of people who had learned that safety was always temporary. Hosea sat closest to the fire, her ancient face lit by the flames. She spoke mostly Apache, but her English came in bursts, sharp and surprising. "Good cabin," she told Elias. "Strong walls, lonely walls." He didn't answer. "A house without voices is just a box," she added, closing her eyes. "Even a bear needs someone to growl at." The blizzard lasted 5 days. In that time, something happened that Elias couldn't have predicted and wouldn't have believed if someone had told him. The women didn't just survive, they improved everything they touched. The tall woman, Kai, turned out to be a masterful hunter. On the second day, when the wind briefly dropped, she borrowed Elias's rifle, disappeared into the white, and returned 2 hours later, dragging a mule deer that would feed them all for a week. She cleaned it and butchered it with a speed and efficiency that made Elias, a man who had lived off the land for 3 decades, feel like an amateur. The twin girls, Nita and Ceci, discovered that his goats were producing half the milk they should have been, and within 2 days they'd adjusted the feed, cleaned the stalls, and somehow coaxed the stubborn old nanny goat into giving more than she had in years. The young mother Elu, quiet as she was, looked at his garden plot through the window and told Apache something that Apache translated. "She says your soil is dying because you've been planting the same crops in the same place for too many years. She knows how to fix it." And Apache herself, she organized everything. Firewood rotations, cooking schedules, water collection from the snowmelt. She didn't ask permission, she just saw what needed doing and did it, the way a woman does when she's been responsible for keeping people alive and has no time for politeness. Elias watched all of this from the edges of his own home, feeling like a stranger in a place he'd built with his own hands. It wasn't anger he felt. It was something closer to awe, mixed with a discomfort he couldn't name. For 30 years, this mountain had been his silence, his struggle, his solitude, and in 5 days these women had walked in and shown him that everything he thought he'd mastered, hunting, building, surviving, he'd only been doing half as well as he could have. On the 5th night, when the storm finally broke and the stars came out sharp and cold above the snow-covered peaks, Elias sat on the porch with a pony. The children were asleep inside. The other women had returned to the barn, which they'd insulated so thoroughly during the blizzard that it was now warmer than it had been when Elias first built it. "Your people will be looking for you," Elias said. "We have no people left to look," a pony replied. "You must have somewhere to go." She was quiet for a long time. The moonlight caught the silver in her hair and made her look both ancient and ageless. "I had a husband," she said. "His name was Tarak. He was a good man, strong but gentle. When the soldiers came, he stood in front of our lodge and told them we would not move. They shot him where he stood, in front of me, in front of our daughter." She paused. "Our daughter was 14. She ran to him. They took her. I have not seen her since." Elias felt the words land in his chest like stones. "I'm sorry. I did not tell you this for pity," a pony said. "I told you because you asked where we would go, and I want you to understand. There is nowhere. The world behind us is ash. The world ahead is snow. This mountain is the only thing between us and nothing." She looked at him. "I am not asking you to save us. I am asking you to let us save ourselves. Give us the winter. That is all. When the snow melts, we will go." Elias stared out at the mountains. 30 years of silence, 30 years of telling himself he didn't need anyone, that the mountain was enough, that solitude was strength. And now this woman sat beside him, asking for the one thing he'd never given anyone, a place to stay. "The barn needs a new roof before January," he said. "That south wall's going to buckle if we get another storm like this one." A pony looked at him. "I can fix a roof." "I know you can. That's why I'm telling you." She didn't smile, but something shifted in her expression, a loosening of the guard she'd been holding. "The winter then," she said. "The winter," he agreed. And just like that, without ceremony or contract, the mountain that had belonged to one man for 30 years became home to 13 souls. The weeks that followed were the strangest of Elias's life, and he'd spent 3 decades perfecting the art of living alone, and now every corner of his world had someone in it. Kai hunted nearly every day, often bringing back more game than Elias had caught in a month. She didn't talk much, but when she cleaned her kills by the creek, she sang low songs in Apache that echoed off the canyon walls and made the whole valley feel like a church. Nita and Ceci turned the goat operation into something almost professional, producing enough milk and cheese to trade, if there had been anyone to trade with. They laughed constantly, finishing each other's sentences in a mix of Apache and English that only they seemed to fully understand. Elu redesigned the garden. She drew plans in the dirt with a stick, explaining through a pony that the soil needed rest and rotation, that certain plants fed the earth while others drained it, that Elias had been fighting the land instead of working with it. He listened, feeling foolish and grateful in equal measure. The young mother, whose toddler, a boy named Dasan, had started following Elias around like a second shadow, had a way of explaining things without judgment, as if bad farming was simply an honest mistake anyone might make after 30 years of doing it wrong. Hosea, the elder, rarely left the cabin. She sat by the fire, wrapped in blankets, watching everything with eyes that missed nothing. She told stories in the evenings, long, winding tales in Apache that the other women listened to with the kind of attention you give to something sacred. Elias couldn't understand the words, but he understood the rhythm. The way the voices of the women rose and fell with the telling, the way the children's eyes grew wide, the way even Kai, fierce, quiet Kai, would stop what she was doing and listen. One evening a pony translated for him. "She's telling the story of how the mountains were made," a pony said. "In our telling, the mountains are the bones of a great woman who lay down to protect her children from a flood. She became the earth so they could stand on her back and survive." Elias looked at the old woman by the fire, then at the peaks visible through the window, white and immense against the dark sky. "That's a good story," he said. "It's not a story," a pony replied. "It's the truth." By December, Elias had stopped counting the days until spring. He told himself it was because he was busy, which he was. There was always something to repair, something to build, something to haul, but the truth was simpler than that. He'd stopped counting because for the first time in 30 years, he didn't want the days to end. He didn't want the snow to melt. He didn't want them to leave. This realization hit him one morning while he was teaching Dasan, the toddler, how to stack kindling. The boy's small hands kept dropping the sticks, and each time he'd look up at Elias with an expression of such earnest frustration that Elias heard himself laugh. It was a strange sound, rough and unfamiliar, like an instrument that hadn't been played in decades. A pony passing by with an armload of firewood stopped and stared at him. "What?" he asked. "Nothing," she said. "I just didn't know you could do that." The trouble arrived in January. the way trouble always does in the mountains, without warning and with teeth. Elias was returning from checking his trap line when he spotted tracks in the snow. Boot prints, heavy, recent, military issue. 3 sets, heading northeast along the ridge that overlooked his property. He followed them for half a mile until they stopped at a clearing with a direct view of his cabin, the barn, and the corral where the women's horses were visible. Someone had stood here for a while. The snow was packed down, and he found the stub of a cigar frozen in the ice. They'd been watching. He didn't tell the women immediately. He spent the rest of the day reinforcing the cabin door, checking his ammunition, and making sure the rifle was clean. That evening, he told a pony. Her face didn't change. How many? 3 that I saw. Could be more. Soldiers? Boot prints say yes. She nodded slowly. They've been looking for us since the summer. We thought the mountain would hide us through the winter. Perhaps we were wrong. You weren't wrong. Someone talked. Trading post, maybe. Or a hunter who spotted your horses. A pony looked toward the barn where the other women were settling in for the night. If they come, they will take us back to the reservation. Or worse, they won't take you. She looked at him sharply. You cannot fight the United States Army, Elias. I'm not planning to fight anyone, but this is my land. Has been for 30 years. No one comes onto my property without my say-so. And I haven't said so. 3 days later they came. Not soldiers, as Elias had expected, but something worse. A civilian posse. 6 men on horseback. They led by a man Elias recognized from the trading post 40 miles south, a thick-necked rancher named Briggs who'd made his fortune selling land that wasn't his to sell and whiskey to people who shouldn't have been drinking it. Briggs stopped his horse at the edge of the clearing and called out in a voice that echoed off the peaks. Kane, we know you've got Apache women up here. Army's offering a reward for their return. Make this easy. Elias stood on his porch, rifle across his arms, Clove growling at his feet. There's nobody here but me and my dog, Briggs. We've seen the horses, Kane. Don't play stupid. Those are my horses. Since when do you keep 10 horses? Since I felt like it. Briggs shifted in his saddle. Look, I've got no quarrel with you. Hand them over and there's money in it. $50 a head. You're talking about human beings. I'm talking about fugitives. You're talking about women and children. Don't make this difficult, Kane. Elias didn't move. Behind him, he heard the cabin door open. He didn't need to look. He knew it was a pony. She stepped up beside him, and behind her came Kai, carrying the rifle she'd been hunting with all winter. Then the twins, then Elu, with her baby strapped to her chest and fire in her eyes. One by one, the women filed out of the cabin and the barn until all 10 of them stood in a line across the front of the property, silent, straight-backed, faces set like the mountains behind them. Briggs looked at them, then at Elias, then at the line of women again. His men shifted uncomfortably in their saddles. You're outnumbered, Orsh Kane. I can count. This won't end well for you. It hasn't ended well for me in 52 years. I'm used to it. One of the men in the back, younger, nervous, spoke up. Briggs, there's kids here. This ain't what you said it'd be. Shut up. I didn't ride up here to drag women and babies through the snow. Another man nodded. He's right. This don't feel right. Briggs's face went red. You'll do what I tell you to. No, Elias said, his voice cutting through the cold air like an axe. They won't, because you're not the law, Briggs. You're a profiteer with a badge you bought at a card game. And if you don't turn those horses around right now, I'll put a hole in your hat and let the mountain decide what happens next. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Briggs stared at Elias for a long time. Then he looked at the women, at a pony's calm, unblinking gaze, at Kai's steady hands on the rifle, at the baby sleeping against Elu's chest, and whatever calculation he was running in his head came out against him. This isn't over, he said. It is for today, Elias replied. Briggs pulled his horse around. One by one, his men followed. The last one, the young one who'd spoken up, looked back at the women, tipped his hat, and rode away. Nobody moved until the sound of hooves faded completely. Then Hosea, who had been watching from the cabin window the entire time, called out something in Apache. The women laughed, even a pony. Elias looked at her. What did she say? She said. The bear finally remembered how to growl. That night they ate together in the cabin, all of them. It was crowded and loud and warm. The children sat on the floor. The women passed bowls of stew and bread that Elu had baked using flour they'd been rationing since November. Elias sat at his small table, surrounded by more people than his cabin had ever held, and felt something crack open in his chest that he'd spent 30 years trying to keep sealed shut. A pony sat beside him. Their shoulders touched, and neither of them moved away. They'll come back, he said quietly. Probably. With real soldiers next time. Then we'll be ready. How? Together? He looked at her. She looked at him. And in that look was everything neither of them had said. About loss, about loneliness, about the way 2 people can carry the same wound for decades and only recognize it when they see it in someone else's eyes. I stopped living 30 years ago, Elias said. I just forgot to stop breathing. Then breathe now, Apache replied. There is no point in surviving if you do not live. He reached across the table and took her hand. It was the first time he'd touched another person in years. Her skin was rough and warm, her fingers strong. She didn't pull away. Dasan climbed into Elias's lap and fell asleep there, one small fist clutching the front of his shirt. Hasea began telling another story. Kai cleaned her rifle by the fire. The twins braided leather cord for new bridles, and Elu hummed a song to her baby that sounded like wind through the pines and water over stone. Spring came slowly, the way it always did on the mountain. The snow pulled back from the valleys first, then the ridges, then finally the meadow where the first green shoots pushed through like small declarations of faith. Elu's garden plan came to life. Beans, squash, corn, and herbs stretched across a plot twice the size of the old one. Kai built a smokehouse. Aponi organized the construction of 2 new shelters, structures that were half Apache wiki-up and half frontier cabin, something new that belonged to neither world and both. Elias worked alongside them every day. He hauled timber, dug post holes, and learned Apache words for things he'd known in English his whole life. Aponi taught him patiently, with a dry humor that surfaced at unexpected moments. You speak Apache like a horse trying to sing, she told him one afternoon. But at least you try. The soldiers never came, whether it was because Judge Tomlin in the valley had intervened, or because the army had bigger problems, or simply because the mountain was too remote and the women too few to matter to men making decisions in offices 1,000 miles away. Elias never knew. But the spring turned to summer, and the summer turned to fall, and nobody came with guns or papers or threats. The mountain held them. The mountain kept them safe. On a warm evening in September, Elias and Aponi sat on the porch watching the sun go down behind the western peaks. The sky was the color of fire and copper, and the valley below was gold with turning aspens. Inside, the children were laughing. Kai was teaching Dasan to count in Apache. Hasea was humming something old and beautiful. You said the winter, Aponi said. That's what we agreed. Elias nodded. The winter. It's September. I know what month it is. The snow will come soon, and then it will be winter again. He looked at her. What are you saying? I'm saying that if you want us to leave, you need to say it now. Because if the snow comes and we're still here, I don't think I'll want to go. Elias was quiet for a long time. He looked at the cabin he'd built alone 30 years ago. He looked at the new shelters beside it, smoke rising from their chimneys. He looked at the garden, the expanded corral, the smokehouse, the children playing in the meadow. He looked at the mountain, which had been his whole world for so long that he'd forgotten the world was bigger than one man's grief. Stay, he said. Not for the winter, for good. Aponi didn't speak. She just leaned her head against his shoulder and closed her eyes. They sat like that as the light faded. 2 people who had spent their lives learning how to survive alone, finally discovering that the hardest thing wasn't enduring the cold, it was letting someone in. And the mountain, which had watched Elias Kane live and grieve and freeze and thaw for 30 long years, seemed to settle deeper into the earth that evening, as if it too was relieved that its loneliest soul had finally found what he'd been missing. Not silence, not strength, not solitude, just someone to sit with on the porch, watching the aspens turn gold and knowing that the cold wouldn't come alone. If this story moved your heart, if it reminded you that shelter isn't just a roof but the people beneath it, then this is the place for you. Subscribe for more tales of courage, quiet bravery, and love that defies time and circumstance. Every story is crafted to stay with you long after the last word. Subscribe now and never miss a heartbeat.